Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the final episode of Your Legislators Season 19. I'm your host, Jonny Coker. We're in the final days of New Mexico's legislative session, and joining me to talk about the sprint to the finish is the representative for New Mexico's 53rd District, Representative Sarah Silva. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I just wanted to, before we really get into the meat of the legislation, how has this legislation been? How successful do you think it's been? And, what are you really looking for in that final sprint to the finish?
Yeah, I appreciate those questions. I didn't really know what to expect as a new freshman legislator. I feel like personally, I learned a lot, and I feel like I'm having a really successful session. And I think as a whole, the party and our agenda and what we sought to accomplish is also looking really bright. And I'm excited to talk about a couple of those things today with you.
Absolutely. And one of those big pieces of legislation and that you've spoken about in multiple opinion columns, both on KRWG.org as well as the Albuquerque Journal and other news outlets, is House Bill 153. This would prevent state entities from compelling journalists to disclose protected info, including sources and other information. And before we get into the meat of that bill, what compelled you to sponsor that legislation?
Right. Well, a couple of things. So full disclosure, I'm married to a journalist. But second, as a community organizer, I really relied on journalists to tell the stories of the issues and the people that we were working with, and in order to move and compel change. And so having that history of having really good in-depth journalism at the local level was always something that was really critical to my profession. And so that was one. And then the other is, as we have seen the new administration, the new federal administration, attack the media and journalists, that is a slippery slope to eroding our First Amendment rights and freedom of speech. And so, and being able to access truthful information and honest information about the news that's happening around us. And so when we erode that, we erode one of the pillars of democracy. And so that's what compelled me to introduce this legislation. The press shield law hasn't been updated in New Mexico since 1973. And so the internet didn't exist then. The way journalism is done today didn't exist. And so I really wanted to update that law. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and it was a really hard bill to try and get through, given all the other challenges and issues that were facing our state.
Yeah, and obviously there are the time constraints, but what other major hurdles were facing this legislation in terms of its ability to move forward within the state's legislature in order to make it to the governor's desks? What were the major hurdles there?
Yeah, I think one is having to explain why this is needed and the importance of it, and that even though there isn't a big glaring problem now, I want to prevent one from happening. And so there wasn't the I think perceived urgency around this bill and around updating this legislation. And then the other is I think understanding the complexities of the press shield law in New Mexico. So it wasn't just like, oh, we can pass a bill and then it's updated. The Supreme Court actually has its own ruling. And so this bill would have only prevented state entities like the legislature or the executive branch from issuing subpoenas for unnamed sources or documents or other notes from journalists. This would not have included the judicial branch at all. And so after this session is over, myself and the attorney, my expert witness, Charles Purcell, and I will be pursuing an update to that rule through the Supreme Court. And so that the judicial branch can update its press shield law, and that doesn't need legislation. And so I'm looking forward to advancing that this year.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in your column for the Albuquerque Journal that the most necessary steps to protect the press is an update to that Supreme Court's shield rule. So can you just tell me, what is the process going to look like after the legislative session is over? What is your work going to look like moving forward in order to looking for amendments or updates to that ruling?
Right. So that process, I was able to meet with two of the Supreme Court justices while I was up here in Santa Fe, and also with their general counsel, and talk about that process and this legislation, House Bill 153. And basically what it is an attorney needs to submit a request for the Rules Committee of the Supreme Court to review that ruling and then update it. And so we can make a request, and then the Rules Committee of the Supreme Court will look at it, and then they will determine the definitions for journalists, the definitions for journalism, and then what parameters they would set for evidence. And then that's just all in their hands. So what we can do, though, is make that request to the Supreme Court.
And in the same vein, this sponsored legislation of yours did run out of time, and it's not going to be able to be heard for the next 2 years unless there are some major updates to the way the New Mexico legislative session works. And House Joint Resolution 1 paves the way for 2 45-day sessions where, that type of legislation can be heard. And I saw that it passed the House on a vote of 59-4. It passed with very little opposition. Yet it's sitting in the Senate Rules Committee. How much of a conversation is there within the state's legislature about how much of a push there is to get this legislation past the finish line? And, as a joint resolution, it's a constitutional amendment, so it'll go to voters. But do you expect that to even happen, or what types of conversation are happening in the Roundhouse when it comes to that legislation?
Right. I think that this House Joint Resolution, along with other bills that are being considered, are all moving at different paces around what to do with the structure of the legislature. And that includes, do we pay legislators? Do we increase the per diems? Do we change the dates and times that we meet? And I really believe that much of this legislation is to push us to have conversations in the interim. I think many of these bills are introduced in order to begin conversations and create a little bit of tension that can push people to think in different and new ways. And I think that those are healthy conversations to be having. I think Representative McQueen's bill is an excellent one to split, 45 days so that we can have a multitude of conversations about legislation in any given session. And I, as you said, it's sitting in Senate rules, and we have a few days left in the session.
And, just to stick on that conversation a little bit more, do you feel that you're a freshman legislator, but do you feel that more needs to be done in terms of legislative modernization when it comes to, paying legislators a salary? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I absolutely support modernizing the legislature. I mean, we're still doing business the way that we did when Santa Fe was an old sleepy mountain town, and people had to take horses and buggies up here to get to the Capitol. And that is unrealistic for the challenges that our state faces and the problems we want to solve. And so I think modernizing the legislature is definitely a conversation we need to have. I was still working as full time as I could while I was up here, and it was very stressful. And so not modernizing the legislature keeps certain New Mexicans from participating in our public body.
And again, in a similar line of thinking in a similar vein. A piece of legislation that you've sponsored is House Bill 143, which recently passed in the Senate. The Lobbyist Regulation Act would aim to enhance transparency in lobbying activities. I think you could argue that that is also part of modernizing the state's legislature. You sponsored this legislation along with Jeff Steinborn. So, what is the significance? What would be the significance should this bill make its way through the state legislature to the governor's desk?
Yeah. So House Bill 143 is a lobbyist activity report bill that basically allows for, that would require a lobbyist to name who their employer is and what legislation they're working to influence in the roundhouse. That currently doesn't exist. And when I talk to constituents across House District 53, there is this real and perceived notion that our public body is influenced by lobbyist dollars and their presence. And so even if that's real or not, people perceive it that way. And then it builds mistrust and lack of confidence in our body to make decisions. And so what I wanted to do was introduce this piece of legislation to demonstrate, one, that we value transparency, but two, it is extremely important to hold accountable people who have immense amounts of organized knowledge. Lobbyists are some of the most knowledgeable people in the roundhouse. They do offer great insights into various issues and policy work. But they also have organized relationships because they're paid to be there just as long as we are for 60 days. And they're paid, and this is their full-time job, to influence legislation. And organized money. And so when you have organized ideas, relationships, and money concentrated into one set of people, that I think in and of itself isn't dangerous, but when it's kept in the dark, can become very dangerous. And so I wanted to shed some light on that. This is the furthest the lobbyist transparency bill has gotten through the state legislature in decades. And so I'm very excited that Senator Steinborn and I were able to get this bill passed both on the House and the Senate floor. It has to go back for concurrence in the House, which I'm hoping will happen imminently, which just means the Senate made some changes to the bill, and so it needs to go back to the House for concurrence, and then go to the governor for a signature. So I, as a freshman legislator, this was not an easy bill, but it was a very necessary one to get through.
And the bill would have far-reaching implications and would bring that type of transparency to the public. Do you think that transparency brought upon by this bill, like how would it change the way, in your mind, how would it change the way that legislators legislate and the way that lobbyists work within the roundhouse? Do you think there would be any major changes, or would it simply just be, dotting I's, crossing T's on, who has their fingers where, essentially?
Yeah. Colorado has a similar bill where lobbyists have to report the legislation that they're working to influence. And so, and they've adapted to it very well. I think what it would change is for constituents like ours in Las Cruces. We're 4 hours away from Santa Fe. My constituents in House District 53 can't watch all the webcasts of all the committee meetings to keep up to speed on the issues that matter to them. What they can do is, what this bill would require, is that they could then go to the NM Legis website where you look up a bill or you look up my contact information. And on the same page where you see House Bill 143, for example, if there will be a button that you can click on and then see all the lobbyists that work to influence that piece of legislation. That doesn't exist right now. And so that's, I think, what would change, is that we would get, New Mexicans, constituents would get a fuller picture of the lifespan of a bill and who influenced it at any given moment throughout a 60 or 30-day session.
And New Mexico ranks fairly low in terms of state transparency. Open Secrets ranked the state 41st in lobbyist disclosure laws in 2022. Yet the bill passed 36-26 on that House floor vote. So there's like a decent amount of opposition to this legislation. What's your response to the opposition that this bill is seeing?
That's a question for the folks that are opposing this bill. I think the majority, as we've seen in the House and the Senate, the majority of legislators want more transparency in the process that we participate in. I think that there are those who think it might go too far or doesn't go far enough. And quite frankly, I agree. I think there is more transparency legislation we could do. And I have seen, when I was not a legislator, this body reject more comprehensive transparency bills because, you know, people are used to working in the conditions that they currently have, and I think we can do better for New Mexicans.
And Representative, I did want to move on a little bit. As a member of the House and Tax and Revenue Committee, I wanted to ask about House Bill 14. This would repeal the existing working families tax credit and establish the earned income tax credit, as well as introduce a surtax on certain oil and gas products, among many other provisions. This is a large bill. So you voted to pass this bill on the House floor. What are the most important aspects of this legislation in your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I appreciate that question. So I do sit on House Tax and Revenue Committee. I also sit on Finance and Appropriations. And being on the two money committees has been really illuminating for me. And one of the reasons that I advocated on the House floor so strongly for House Bill 14 was because it was one of the most systemic and significant tax packages that I think New Mexico, the legislature and the House has passed. So what the earned income tax credit would do is it would extinguish the state tax liability for nearly half of New Mexicans. So it now includes the working tax family credit that we repealed did not include single adults without children as part of this tax package. The earned income tax credit, this new one that we passed, now includes single adults who don't have children. If you make $25,000 annually or less, you now don't have to pay state income tax. Your tax liability has been extinguished. If you are a family of four that makes under $70,000 a year in New Mexico, you will not have to pay state income tax. This is incredible. So for me, as a representative that represents the community of Chaparral, which is the largest unincorporated community in the state of New Mexico, the median income there is $46,000 a year for a family. And that means that almost the entire working part of Chaparral, so working families, 40, folks who are living in Chaparral, the vast majority of those residents will not pay any state income tax. House Bill 14 is basically wiping the tax liability for communities as a whole. And that puts money back into the pockets of not just single individuals, but entire towns and cities across the state. That's an incredible impact economically that we can have on our families.
And you mentioned sitting on those money committees. How does the bill fit within the state's overall budget priorities? And are there concerns, especially with the oil and gas provisions, regarding the potential volatility around that industry?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So one, we as a state have done really well the past few years to insulate the state of New Mexico from oil and gas volatility. We have about 32% of our total budget, 32% of that is in reserves, so that we're not spending at the same rate that oil and gas becomes volatile. That is a huge shift from how business was done, even 8-10 years ago. And including in House Bill 14, yes, we raised the royalty rates on oil companies that do business in New Mexico because we were taxing oil at a lower rate than we were natural gas. So we just wanted to bring it on par to natural gas. And we wanted to recoup some of that money. And I will say, this is New Mexico's oil. And the oil and gas industry has the privilege of extracting that oil and making billions off of it annually. And so this additional royalty tax rate gives New Mexico about 130 million extra dollars annually. So I think that's a pretty good deal for New Mexicans and in oil and gas in the state. The other thing that I'll add, Jonny, is as you were talking about like how this all works together in the budget, this was the first year in the state of New Mexico where our investment funds revenue, so the revenue that we get from investing funds, the interest on those funds, outpaced the revenue that the state of New Mexico received in personal income tax. So that means that we as New Mexicans are creating revenue that isn't coming directly out of our pockets. And that for the first time, our revenue funds our investment funds have exceeded the personal income tax revenue. And that is incredible. And I'm really excited about how those funds are growing and continue to build out all the programs and benefits for New Mexicans.
And, I do want to talk a little bit more about where that money could potentially go to, but I did want to ask, of course, speaking of lobbyists and lobbying within the Roundhouse, there's plenty of that for the oil and gas industry, and there's plenty of arguments, about how this, extra tax could affect production and investment in the state in terms of the oil and gas industry. So what is your response to those arguments?
Well, my response is we're still in the middle of the pack as a state in terms of our tax royalty rates. Texas outpaces our taxing rate for the oil producing companies that do business in Texas. And New Mexico has some of the best oil in the world. The land that is drilled and the work that's done here is just outcompete many other places where people could be drilling for oil. And I would also say that much of the money that gets produced and created out of the oil and gas industry are from multinational corporations that don't have businesses in even the United States, right? These are global multinational corporations. And again, like they have the privilege of doing business in New Mexico and extracting our resource. And so I think it's fair for us to be asking for a little bit more for New Mexicans so that we can do and take care of New Mexicans as best as we can.
And the representative, I did want to move on. We don't have a ton of time left, but I did want to ask about the doctor shortage in the state and conversations in the Roundhouse stemming from that doctor shortage. For my first question, I guess, do you feel that enough is being done to attract doctors and even behavioral health providers to the state of New Mexico?
Oh, such a big question. So first, I think that there is always more that we can do. I was a co-sponsor on Senate Bill 176 that would have reformed medical malpractice in the state of New Mexico, and was really frustrated to see it stall on the Senate side. And we're going to keep working on it. I know I have a number of physicians and people who need healthcare in House District 53 that cannot find specialists. And that are going to Texas and Arizona for medical care, and that is unacceptable. So I think there's more that we can do around medical malpractice. I think that the Democrats and my party are taking this conversation more seriously this session, and I'm glad to see that. I was also a co-sponsor on a bill that would have exempted the gross receipts tax for healthcare equipment in New Mexico, and again, seeing that get stalled, I'm hoping that we can have some more relief for physicians and doctors. I'm really glad to see that our HB2, the House budget that we passed, did have set-asides for money that would invest in more healthcare training and investment in attracting healthcare students and medical students to New Mexico. I was really happy to support the work of Burrell, our osteopathic medical school in Las Cruces. And so I think that there's some really bright spots, but yes, there is much more that we need to do in the interim, and I'll be pushing for that.
And, New Mexico, well, let me start with this. Think New Mexico, the bipartisan think tank, had a policy report that mentioned the medical malpractice lawsuits, New Mexico having one of the highest rates of those as one of the reasons there's, such a doctor shortage. And you mentioned working in the interim to fix that. So, and this will be my last question, what can be done in the interim to continue to work on this issue that is really pressing New Mexicans right now?
Yeah, so I'll end with this, is that if you as a constituent, as a resident of New Mexico, are feeling frustrated about the work that either got done or didn't get done during the session, the time in between sessions is really important to get to know legislators, schedule meetings with me or others that are in your district, and talk about these issues, because that helps inform the bills that we write. There are interim committee meetings that meet all across the state. And so when I talk about doing things in the interim, legislators meet in these in-between times between sessions to craft legislation. And I want constituents in the room when those bills get crafted. And so I'll be inviting folks from House District 53 to be joining in on those conversations, and looking forward to being home. I miss home. So looking forward to coming back and working with everyone.
Well, very good. Representative Sarah Silva, thank you so much for coming on the program. It was a great conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Of course. And that's all for this year's season of Your Legislators. And I couldn't have done it alone. Our director is Courtney Hill, head of production is Christian Valle, and our senior producer is David Vasquez III. Thanks to our executive producer, Anthony Moreno, for keeping the wheels churning, and special shout out to our student crew that helped us throughout this season. Next week at this time, we'll be back with KRWG's Fronteras, A Changing America. In the meantime, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For all of us here at KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker, and we'll see you next time.